Hey guys, welcome to the Kane Audio vlog. It's Friday, it's time for another Ask Me Anything. Usual rules apply. Ask me anything you want below this video, and next Friday I'll get back to you and answer the questions reading out the comments of last week's. Before I get started, house admin. It's not only Friday, but it's the Friday before Christmas. So first of all, Merry Christmas to everyone. As it happens, the Fridays don't really sort of get bothered by Christmas this period. So yeah, so I'll still be able to do next week's. It's not a problem. So yeah, by all means, get involved and get commenting. I can't think of, for some reason I'm wheezing today, sorry. I can't think of any other house admin. Same as usual, lots going on, but nothing that I feel I need to tell you about. I think I might have said last week, We Are Friends Volume 8 has been announced, so check the Mau5trap page or my fan page and all of that. Yeah, they've started putting out some teasers. There's some bangers in that, so yeah, it should be a good release. Yeah, I can't think of anything else, so straight on with the show. At the top, Rod Marconi, Zoom, high five. What a great question and answer on last week's AMA. Your thoughts on the difference between an amateur track and a professional one. My question, please, this week. I have been using Logic for about 6 years and would be petrified to try and learn another DAW. I notice you use Bitwig. What positives or even negatives do you see in making the switch? Many thanks. A lot of people put a lot of importance on the workstation. I suppose I kind of do, but only because I figure stick with what you know, kind of. So in terms of Bitwig, if somebody is just looking at starting to produce music, I would highly recommend Bitwig to start, because like I say, stick with what you know, and if you get to know Bitwig first, then great, you're ahead of the curve. I feel that Bitwig is ahead of most others when it comes to functionality, flexibility, ease of use, I suppose. The only negative, if it's a negative, that I have against Bitwig at the moment is the fact that it doesn't support video, which would be a huge bonus for me in particular. But there are VSTs out there that wrap video into VSTs into your workstation, so I don't think it's the end of the world. The only other negative, I suppose, is that Bitwig is not what we would call the industry standard, meaning if you were to get a job in a commercial studio environment somewhere, whether that be, you know, a recording studio like Abbey Road, or you know, an SFX studio, or any of those sorts, then most of them really run on something like Pro Tools. You know, most of them will have copies of other things like maybe Ableton, maybe Cubase or Nuendo, something like that, maybe Logic if they're Mac based. But most, in fact the vast majority of commercial studios will not have Bitwig, because it's new to the game, and all of us producers are sticklers, so you know, we don't tend to change very often. So, you know, I mean, it took me moving to Ableton from, what did I use before that? Cubase, yeah, and Nuendo. It took me sort of 6 months of trying to produce something in Ableton before I was able to actually sort of get something that I was satisfied with. And same again when I moved from Ableton to Bitwig. Took me another 6 months, and it got to a point where I thought, right, okay, I know enough about Bitwig to be able to start a track from scratch. And I just had to force myself from here on in. I'm no longer using Ableton. I'm now, every new project I start is in Bitwig. And I think it probably took me 6 months of playing around before I got to that point, and then probably another few months or so before I was actually making tracks that I felt were to whatever I wanted my standard to be. So the transition from changing a workstation is an arduous task at best. It's, you know, it's not an easy feat, because we're sticklers and because we just get used to all the shortcuts on the keyboard. We get used to where the mouse clicks are. We get used to all of these things, and I think when you're in a creative job, you want that creative flow there, and you want everything to just be quick and natural, basically. And I think changing from any workstation to any other workstation, you know, it becomes unnatural for a while your muscle memory starts kicking in. So I think that's the biggest part, and that goes for anything. It's not just Bitwig specific. As for Logic, you know, Logic is a solid workstation. For those of you who've been following me for a while, you'll know I have some issues with Apple these days, and I've noticed that some Logic users are still having those issues, you know, to do with updates and being forced into updates and new environments. And, you know, I know there was a big hoo-ha about upgrading to Logic X, and people were getting forced into it, and that's not what you want as an audio producer. You know, we can cope with being forced into OS updates and whatever, and previous versions no longer being supported, but I think when it comes to your workstation, you know, if you've got a 6-month project ahead of you and you're scoring for an entire film or something along those lines, and you've done, you know, 80% of the project, and then maybe the production gets delayed for 6 months, so you could be coming back to projects that are maybe a year old. If that's the case and you're in an environment that is no longer supported, you can come into some serious problems. I would also say a downside for someone like Logic, because it's owned by Apple, music producers are not Apple's forefront. They're not their key focus. So whenever I had problems with Ableton, I could send them an email, or if I was desperate for a problem, which there were a couple of times, I went to a recording studio just outside of Cardiff once, and for some reason my license on Ableton, I had to install Ableton on this machine, and my license key wasn't working, and I could phone up the office in Berlin, tell them what the problem was, and they fixed it within seconds, and it was seconds. You know, they were able to access my account, load in a new license and go, there you go, use that one, boom, done. You know, Bitwig is the same. Admittedly, Bitwig, I'm friends with some of the staff there, so it's a bit different, but I know that the support channel, which I usually use just the standard support channel on Bitwig because I don't want to be pestering my friends, and yeah, they're really responsive, you know, and there's a great community behind it. So I think there's a lot of advantages in the bigger picture when it comes to things like, well, both Ableton and Bitwig in particular. You know, if you're dealing with someone like Pro Tools, I'll be honest, Avid are just a nightmare to deal with. I had all sorts of issues with Pro Tools, and they were just nothing but trouble. Every time I needed to update something or upgrade something, unless I was giving them my money, they were just a nightmare to deal with. Which is what actually made me drop Pro Tools in the end, and I binned it because it was just a waste of money, and that made me move to Harrison Mixbus for my mixdowns. And again, the Harrison team, that's another good workstation actually, because admittedly I only use them for my mixdowns, but The support team, again, I have been onto their forum, and I think I asked for something to be changed, and they did change it, and then I asked for something else to be changed, and they said they wouldn't, and gave me justified reasons why they wouldn't, and I, you know, sort of sat back and went, oh yeah, that makes sense, fair enough. So I think these are the important things that you've got to think about when you're looking at any software, really. What kind of community is behind it, and what's the company like? Because, you know, when we commit to something, we commit to it. So yeah, that's a big deal. I've waffled for about 10 minutes on that. I should move on. So Nathan Zaskarinskis, Zoom, high five. Hopefully you give a good answer for the other question about switching to Bitwig, as I'm also considering changing from Ableton to that. Okay, there we go. So specifically from, I'll recap that a bit, because the change from Logic to Bitwig will be a big difference. I'm not saying you'd struggle, but I think getting used to dealing with clip launches versus the arrangement screen, there are a lot of differences with things like that. There will be some things that you're going to miss from Logic, because you're going to miss some of those shortcut keys, because they're radically different in both Ableton and Bitwig. So it's a big jump and a big leap. For me personally, I would say totally worth it. First of all, Bitwig works on Linux, Windows and Mac, so you know there's a huge advantage. If you go into another studio, you don't care what their computer is, you don't care whether it's Windows or Mac or Linux or whatever. So there's loads of differences with things like that. Moving from Ableton to Bitwig, I would say, is much easier, but actually maybe a little bit more frustrating in the little ways, because most of the keyboard shortcuts are pretty much the same, but some of them aren't, and those are the ones where you'll be like, oh, you know, because you're so used to those keyboard commands or whatever, and you're so used to it being one way, and it's just ever so slightly different. Silly things like if you use the mouse to zoom in on the piano roll, to zoom in you move it up in Ableton, you drag it up, and if you drag it down in Bitwig you zoom in, I think, or maybe the other way around. I can't do it without doing it. So yeah, so there's little things like that, but much easier layout. You know, if you're coming from Ableton, you already know the basic layout of the clip launchers and the arrangement screens. There's some more additions to that as well, because you can have the clip launchers in the arrangement screen, and you can also have 2 or 3 monitors, so you could have your mixer, your clip launchers and your arrangements all on separate screens, which is great. So yeah, there's a load of advantages to Bitwig over Ableton. I've played around with the demo, and it seems to have a good amount of stuff for Eurorack control. Oh man, yeah, of course, you're the Eurorack guy. I forgot. Right, in which case Bitwig is definitely going to be good for you, because you've got CV outputs and CV inputs, and hardware controllers. So again, you know, these are the smaller things that Bitwig do that no other workstation has. So you can send CV out signals to modular gear and then bring the audio in, and then you can send it back out as another CV or as MIDI or whatever. So you know, the whole sort of translation between everything from MIDI to CC to OSC to CV to whatever your inputs outputs are, Bitwig has it all. Plus things like the modulators. You know, again, if you're into your Eurorack stuff or modular stuff of any kind, then Bitwig offers you a lot of modulators, which are brilliant for feeding in and out. So yeah, definitely recommend. Which nearly sold me on it, but I'm apprehensive about switching. That's fair enough. I would say if you're going to do it in your own time, and only do it when you're ready, because like I say, it's a big upheaval for anyone to switch from one workstation to another. I did want to ask about syncing external sequencers with a workstation. I've been using my BeatStep Pro to sequence my rack, and I've noticed that the clock seems to be slightly out to Ableton. I'm assuming it's just a latency issue, but is there anything that can be done about it? So it depends on how your clock is out. If your clock is drifting, then it wouldn't be latency. If your clock is delayed, then it would be latency. Another Bitwig advantage is you can send a trigger pulse to read the latency of an input or output, and you can then automatically compensate for that inside Bitwig as well. So again, that's a pretty good one. Also, do you know of any other way other than ASIO for all, as that's crap, to combine audio interfaces within Windows? When you say combine audio interfaces, what do you mean? I would like to combine my own interface with the one in my rack, as it would make life easier than switching between the two. Would using ADAT connections work? I need more information on that. If you can give me another comment in this week's video and tell me roughly the routing. I don't... Why would you have two interfaces? Is it because you've not got enough inputs on your normal DAC? Or what? Because I don't know why you'd have two. I mean, basically, I think maybe answering your question is having more than one interface on any one workstation is just a nightmare, basically. I have tried it before, and I don't think I even managed to get it, because what I wanted to do was, there was a time where I was trying to test different interfaces before I got the Audient. I remember I wanted to have 2 or 3 side by side and switch between them just to listen to the transparency, and I couldn't get that without making a physical switcher, which had a click, and that was a bit annoying. And I wanted to do like a blind test, basically. I wanted to be able to sit there with my back to it and someone else press the switcher for me to see if I could even hear a difference and what those differences are. I didn't get round to doing that. It's still something I really want to be able to do. So if anyone knows the answer to how to achieve that, let me know. So on that, it's a slightly different situation, but having two interfaces was just not possible at the time. Yeah, ASIO for all is crap. Yeah, so I'm guessing by the fact that you're saying would ADAT connections work, you're basically saying that you want to have more inputs or more outputs possibly, and if that's the case, then yeah, ADAT's your answer. That's what I have on my Audient, because my Audient has a couple of analog ins, which is fine for my mic and my main synth, and that's not a problem. But then when you've got a rack of gear next to it and then another rack of gear down there somewhere, yeah, so I use an ADAT and use the optical cables. Yeah, and that works pretty solidly, to be honest. And then on my Audient mixer panel software that comes with it, you can then sort of mix the ADAT levels between each other. Edit. I just had a thought which I think you may have some interesting thoughts. I bought a Eurorack module which is based on a Turing machine and quantizer, so it generates random patterns that are in key and scales. Would you consider something like this to be detracting from the creative process or a good tool for inspiration? Both. Really sorry that this turned into a long ass comment. No problem. They're usually long ass answers. Yeah, I love stuff like that, especially if it's a Turing machine thing. Then I suppose it's a random encryptor type pattern, which is pretty cool, pretty nerdy. That's the kind of thing where, for me, it's one of those self-satisfying things, and for me, as a working professional, I'm always torn between being creative and being efficient, because those two things don't often go together. So I would usually play around with something like that to get the inspiration going in the first place, and then probably use it for a really subtle ARP in the background and nothing too drastic. I wouldn't make it a key feature of the track, because I think it's at that point I'd get carried away with it, really. So yeah, it's one of those things that are great but also equally dangerous. Kavak, another very interesting and informative AMA, Dom. Thanks, and Zoom. High five. Some of the information this week couldn't have come at a better time. I got some feedback on my music that can be summed up as good ideas but keep working on it. However, I'm struggling to pinpoint what could be wrong, as I was quite pleased with how the track sounded. I definitely need experience and better skills with mixing and mastering, but now that I think about it, getting involved with a mix exchange may be premature. I think I need to go back to basics and better train my ears. Do you have any good tips on how to start doing that? Yeah, a few people commenting on last week. That was a pretty good one. I'd recommend it myself. Yeah, I feel like some of the responses you guys have given off the back of last week's AMA, I'm kind of tempted to revisit it and either expand on it, or maybe just chop that bit out of an AMA and post it as a separate video, because unknowingly to me, I seem to have given some advice that seems to have helped a lot of people, which is great, and that's what this whole thing is for. For anyone that didn't watch it, it was a kind of a combination about, I remember there being mixing kicks and bass and stuff like that in there, but I think it was about paying attention to, I remember using the term 4D graph or something, and it was about paying attention to amplitude within frequency ranges and something along those lines. I can't remember what I said, but for one reason or another, people seem to like that, and that's good. So definitely need experience and better skills. You know what? Experience is just one of those things that everybody needs to get to that professional level. You know, people talk about to become an expert in something, you need to put in 10,000 hours. I don't live by that. I don't necessarily agree. If that was the case, then we wouldn't have some, you know, incredibly famous prodigy type kids climbing the ranks. But at the same time, I do think it's probably a good average. So, you know, if you feel that every new track you make makes you feel like your last track was shit, then I would say that's a clue to suggest you're not quite ready yet. I definitely distinctly remember a time where literally every time I opened a new project and made a new track and then listened to the track I'd done maybe last week, I remember thinking, oh, that sounds like shit now, because I'd learnt this new whatever technique or trick or whatever. And I remember thinking, oh, now I'm ready because this track's great. And then I'd write another track and go, oh, now I'm ready because this track's great. And I think if that's happening almost every track you're doing, then you're probably not quite ready. If it's happening maybe every 5 to 10 tracks that you're doing, you've jumped up a level, then you're on a good path. For me, and I don't think that ever stops, so don't get me wrong, if you sometimes get that doesn't mean you're not ready, because I still feel it. I don't know how often. I suppose every year I kind of feel like last year's music was a step in the right direction but not quite nailing it, whereas this year's music has just gone up an extra level. So I hope that never stops. I hope I keep learning and I keep getting better. I hope. So that's something to bear in mind. Experience is a huge deal. But you know what? You're saying that you think your mix exchange may be premature. I say no, go for it. You don't have to release it. There's nothing wrong with making shit music, and there's nothing wrong with a shit mix down, so long as you're learning something along the way. So I would say, by all means, swap a mix with someone, and you do their mix, they do your mix, and you may find that the things they did to your mix would be things that you would never do. You don't have to use that mix, remember, and that was kind of the whole point. So for anyone again who hasn't been following the channel, the idea is in the Dom Kane producer Facebook group, which I'll post in a link below this video. Some of the guys there are swapping mixes because I suggested, you know, if you want to learn to mix or be mixed, then why don't you swap each other's projects and just, you know, I'll mix your project, you mix mine, and we'll see where we go. I think you're never not ready for that in a weird way, because you don't have to use it. If you send someone a track and it's shit, then it doesn't matter. They still get the experience of doing a mix. And I'll be honest, as a professional mix engineer, sometimes you do get shit tracks through, but it's not your decision to say that it's shit. It's not, you know, you might think it's shit, but it's you're not in a position to say it. You might, obviously it's slightly different for me as a professional. I might need to come back and go, actually mate, I think you need to just tweak these few bits here, or maybe this should be done first, or whatever, because I don't want people wasting their money. But hey, if it's a free mix and you're swapping, just go for it. Do it 10 times. It doesn't matter, because every time you do it, you're going to learn something new, and that's kind of the point. So, yeah, I disagree with you there. It's not premature. Go for it. I think I need to go back to basics and better train my ears. Do you have any good tips on how to start doing that? Kind of similar to what I said last week about the whole 4D graph and focusing on amplitude and energy bandwidths, I'll call it now. You know, I think I said last week, if you imagine your speakers are 100 watts of power, it has 100 watts of electrical energy to use on your music. Well, if your bass line is super loud and that's using, say, 50, 60, 70 watts of that power, you've only got, you know, 30, 40 watts left for the whole rest of the track. So you need to pay attention to where the balance is in that, not only in the stereo balance, not only in the overall frequency balance, but you need to merge the frequency and amplitude balance in your head, and think about how much of this speaker's energy is being used up in the kicks and bass, or the mid-range, or whatever it is you're focusing on. And I suppose listening to good quality artists and listening to what they do with their tracks, how do they work, how does it fit into that, you know, and maybe they sometimes do it wrong. I know I've put out some tracks where I've purposefully, Psychoschematics is one of them, I purposely made the hi-hats louder than most people would, and if you listen to that with headphones on full blast, I apologise, but that's kind of the idea, is it was supposed to almost hurt your ears, because I wanted those hi-hats to be sizzling, and that was a subjective choice, that was a creative choice, which is just something I wanted to do, cause pain to my listeners. But yeah, that was kind of the idea, because I knew that in a club that was really going to sizzle inside people's skulls, and I loved that sort of, when you're in a driving sort of techno vibe and you get that hi-hat that just almost burns through your skull. So yeah, pay attention to it. Just, I mean, listening is basically what you got to do. Any resources? No, I think it is just experience, and listen to other people and then practice it, and then listen to more and practice that, and listen to more and practice that, and just keep going over and over again. Yeah, I am gonna be back in a second because I can see my camera's about to hit the 30-minute mark, and I'm back. Right, also I did watch and like last week's AMA, which was equally informative, but forgot to go back and comment in time, so Robot, high five. I had made a mental note to rewatch it and ask follow-up questions, but got caught up with finishing off some tracks. Sorry about that, old bean. If you're finishing tracks, it's all good. Right, moving on, there's only a couple more I think, because there's a bunch of Zooms coming up. Outsider, hi Dom, Zoom, high five. Very informative this week, some great Q&As. On the back of talking about sub-bass frequencies, would you ever high-pass a bass if it was too subby? I want to say yes. I have done it in the past and then regretted it. I mean, how subby is subby? I guess that's the question. And much like I was talking about last week, it's about finding that happy note. If you're using a sub bass line, genre dependent I suppose, but if you're using a sub bass line, mute everything else, drag out a keyboard and play some notes and just slowly go down, because you're going to get to a point where it starts losing energy, then go up a bit from there, and that should be your root note of the track, and that should kind of dictate what scale your track is in, or what key. So that's something I mentioned last week. As for high passing bass, not really, because if you're in the root note sub bass, you shouldn't be going too low anyway. You should be in a position where most speakers can reproduce that note. And the reason I say I want to say yes is because at the production stage I would leave it there. But if you feel, going back to the 4D graph thing, if you feel that's using up loads of energy, then it's probably too loud in the mix, so just bring it down nice and quiet. You know, I think if you're using sub bass underneath a bigger bass line, that sub bass needs to be almost non-existent. It's you know, we love sub bass, everyone does, humans love sub bass. There's, you know, and as much as a consumer we sort of go, oh, I want that to be even louder, you've got to really restrict yourself as a producer and go, I'm going to make the listener want it louder, rather than I'm going to give the listener exactly what he wants and just destroy all speakers. However, high passing it, if you found the right root note, you shouldn't need to be high passing, because there shouldn't be anything below that root note anyway. But where I want to say yes, and I'm being very careful in how I've just worded all of that, the reason being is because when it comes to the mix and master stage, mostly the master, you will generally high pass the whole track anyway, because you don't want any rogue frequencies, say at least below 30 hertz. Anything below 30 hertz is just a waste of money, because show me a speaker that can reproduce 30 hertz. You know, even if you look at high quality studio, you know, several £1,000s worth of subs, even at the absolute utmost high quality level, even then you're going to struggle to find a subwoofer that really reproduces below 30 hertz, let alone comfortably. And yet, you know, even if you look at like monitors, then nah, they're not gonna produce 30 hertz. You'll have a lot of monitors, I can assure you, if you look at the specs online, I'm sure they say they're able to reproduce down to 20 hertz or some bullshit, but they're not. They can't. You know, okay, they might be able to if the only signal they are being given at any given time is a 20 hertz sine wave, then maybe, sure, I'll say, yeah, they can reproduce that. But they cannot reproduce a 20 hertz sine wave on top of a kick drum, on top of a bunch of hi-hats, on top of bass lines and synths and everything on top. That's not how it works. And again, going back to that 4D graph way of looking at things, you know, that's just not going to happen. So, you know, your speakers are going to struggle at anything below really 40 hertz. I would say is about as low as I would ever acceptably go. So when it comes to your mix and master, I tend to stick a high pass filter on at around 30 hertz, because you might get some sub harmonics or something below 40, maybe 35 hertz. I don't know. I can't think straight at the moment, but yeah, probably maybe about, I suppose, down to 40. So I'll put a little safety net at 30 hertz, for example, just in case there's something trying to happen under there, like some sub, I think it's called N harmonics. If there's something trying to happen there that maybe is muddying your mix a bit or whatever, then you know, you just, it's like I say, it's a safety net. So other than that, you know, if your sub is 50 hertz root note and you're setting a high pass at 50 hertz, then you're already 3 dB lower than it should be, and there shouldn't be any need for that anyway. So yeah, there we go, I think. I've tried this before on WAVs when I forget to save presets, and never really like how it sounds after. Too much can make a sound weak or thin. Too little doesn't let things mould nicely, I guess. Yeah, so again, it's that going back to the basics bit and selecting the sounds that complement each other really is what you want to be doing. And again, you know, if you're not, you know, when it comes to presets and things, leave them raw. Leave them as raw as you possibly can, because you can always tweak them later. I suppose at this point it's best to just find another bass or kick. Yeah, so like I just said, have a great weekend. You too. And unknown artist, Zoom, high five. Love this AMA, has been added to my playlist for production. Great tips. The kick and bass chat especially. Thanks again, bud. Looking forward to the next one. Blue, Zoom, high five. Any tips on making beautiful big pads with texture and lots of character? Someone asked me this privately the other day. Can't remember who it was now. It was a friend of mine. I would say the biggest tip when it comes to big pads, first of all, lots of reverb. Even if it's just short reverb, but make it really wet. I would say that, because what that does is that kind of plays with the stereo balance of everything, and it kind of just makes everything sound a bit more 3D, I suppose. So that's something I would do. In terms of synths, I would highly recommend Xfer Serum. Also, Isotope Iris is a really cool one. If I remember rightly, I think there's like 3 samplers on top of each other where you can load in your own WAVs, and they can play at different speeds, and then you can also sort of draw in, so it's almost like a FFT, which is a fast Fourier transform, so like a visual graph display of the sound that was loaded in there, and then you can use like a colouring tool to highlight areas that will play, and then you can set it to sweep forwards and backwards, so it's almost granular, and you can do that on multiple samplers, and there's a couple of oscillators in there as well. So if you're using Xfer Serum, just go mad on the LFOs. Apply one LFO to another LFO, which is maybe applied to an envelope follower of something else, and just really experiment with those things, you know. Just go nuts on them, and don't put any of them in time. So they're obviously, if you're applying it to a filter or something, you probably want it in time, I suppose. But if you are applying it to a filter and you don't want it to be in time, just make sure it's really subtle. The sweep movements of an LFO should be really small, so it's more a slight pulsating sound to it. And again, when it's heavily wet in reverb, a lot of those pulsings are going to carry across as well, so there is no time to it then. Yeah, just have some fun with it, I suppose. But yeah, Isotope Iris as well is another good one. Totally different to Xfer Serum, so I would recommend both if you really want to get weird pads together. Yeah, and I think you can get really experimental with both of those things. In fact, look up on YouTube while you're on YouTube watching this. I know I've seen someone doing some pads and textures on Xfer Serum. I'm sure I have. So have a look while you're on YouTube. And this video is nearly over, because BWO Official, Zoom, high five. Yanis Lukmanis, Zoom, high five. Deadly Custard, Zoom, high five. That is it for this week. So next Friday will be after Christmas. I don't think it's Christmas or Boxing Day. I'm pretty sure that's Tuesday, Wednesday. So yeah, I should be good to do next Friday's video. And then of course it's New Year's and all of that palaver. Yeah, so I think these videos are just going to carry on as normal. Should be good. So I hope you all have a very Merry Christmas, and I hope you eat way too much and feel really sick. And I hope none of you argue too much with your family. And I will see you after Christmas. Cheers. Have a good one.